Are fantasy elves racist? An embodiment of fascist ideology? Are orcs all an allegory for black people? Or are human beings in fantasy just plain boring? These are some of the hot takes that I've seen online a few times, and quite frankly, I think it's a little overdone. I see them time and time again, and I get a little annoyed each time I see them. You might be surprised that someone like me would get annoyed by these takes, given my obvious biases in terms of social commentary, my statements that all art is political and all that, but I think that sweeping generalizations about how all fantasy writers write elves, orcs, goblins, and all that, how they're all depicted in all forms of media, I think it's reductive, highly reductive, and kind of terrible when people make sweeping generalizations, personally. Fantasy as a genre is one of those institutions that is forever open to interpretation, and as such, a lot of people will see a couple of interpretations of a trope or fantasy race, whether in books, films, movies, tabletop RPGs, and just go, well, everything's like this one version of the thing I found, right? It also doesn't help that when particular people who really don't understand what the hell they're talking about decide to make sweeping generalizations about what they're talking about as though they're the authority on the matter, and then crash out when people who are more well-informed than they are speak about it. I'm not saying I'm the most well-informed person, but I mean, more than some people, because I've done a little homework on all these topics. With this video, we're going to discuss two things. First, are fantasy races inherently racist? And second, are fantasy fans maybe projecting their own bigotries onto certain characters? There's a lot to discuss, let's unpack. For better or worse, we need to start with orcs.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Orcs are some of the most iconic fantasy monsters around, though over the years their roles have morphed. Our modern perspective of orcs comes initially from Tolkien's Middle-earth, one of Tolkien's original creations for Middle-earth, not drawn directly from folklore. But a version of orcs became popularized, in part thanks to Gary Gygax and his tabletop RPG, Dungeons and Dragons. Orc tribes are fiercely competitive, and when they meet, it is 75% likely that they will fight each other unless a strong leader, such as a wizard, evil priest, evil lord, with sufficient force behind them, is on hand to control the orcs. Being bullies, the stronger will always intimidate and dominate the weaker.
Whom do you serve? Saruman!
Orcs have appeared in Warhammer, Warcraft, and countless anime. Yet in each iteration, they seem drastically different from one another. Either they're a warlike race of fallen elves, a warring tribal community who proliferate a world that had at a divine level rejected them, or rage-filled idiots who can change reality if they believe really, really hard, and apply a few cans of paint to whatever item they want to supercharge. But that said, a common point of discussion around orcs is that they apparently represent black people. Apparently. So where did that come from? Who was the first to say this? Well, I can tell you this, it's not Tolkien.
Stating in a preface to a reprint of Fellowship of the Ring, I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. Tolkien's attitude was that if people are going to read allegory into his work, fine, have a party, but not to assume that he intended any to be there.
It's difficult to find the exact point where this theory was first popularized. However, one early article is by Paul Sturtevant for The Public Medievalist, titled Race, the Original Sin of the Fantasy Genre. In it, he writes, making evil races like the orcs and Uruk-hai, as described in Lord of the Rings, and dark elves as in D&D, dark-skinned creatures creates fantasy worlds that are structured along racist lines, and mimicking those that plague us in the real world. It would be foolish to explain that away as mere coincidence. Whether the creators did it intentionally or not, their worlds are loaded with the idea at the core of white supremacy, that having dark skin is bad. We'll come back to dark elves much later. For right now, let's talk about orcs. A lot of folks online are probably familiar with a certain video made by the channel Extra Credit, titled Evil Races and Bad Game Design, where it's implied that evil races can exist as a stand-in only for any minority.
Much of the recent conversation on orcs points out that characterizing a whole species in your game as ugly, warlike, and malevolent might be harmful to real-world groups, regularly mischaracterized as ugly, warlike, and malevolent. It's a common trope in speculative fiction, but especially in the context of a game, painting an entire species with the same moral brush actually weakens the entire thing. This idea that a certain subgroup, like race, nationality, or sex, has inalienable traits is called biological essentialism or simply bioessentialism. And it's a valid way to talk about qualities like how many legs an animal has or whether it can fly. But all too often, this concept gets misused in untrue statements, like pit bulls are a violent breed, men are more logical than women, or Asians are better at math.
After all, a race of evil creatures means they must be a stand-in for some human bigotries, right? Well, that's problematic for a number of reasons, and we'll get to that, but there is some basis for this belief system. As Lindsay Ellis pointed out in her video on Bright, all fantasy races have to draw from some human culture. Nothing is ever materialized out of nothing, out of the ether. It draws from something, some form of real culture.
Allegory exists as a statement of authorial intent. Coding may or may not even be a conscious choice. With stories made by and for humans, there is always coding. There's especially coding in fantasy worlds derived from the worlds of Tolkien. Some that were there in the books.
His sense of duty was no less than yours, I deem.
Some that weren't. And on some levels, this is kind of inescapable because it's basically impossible to create fantasy races that aren't at least a little bit derived from the author's perception of human cultures.
And so the natural assumption there means that a monster race must represent some culture in humanity. So what culture gets the unlucky draw?
Much snow in Skyrim. Enough snow. Lake does not want any more.
They also make very good thieves. They like their skooma. Yeah, they're Romani. They're Romani. They're cat Romani.
And a lot of people oversimplify a very complicated topic that I'll discuss in a little bit and jump the gun. As a result of this, you see a lot of people find the obvious loopholes in the conversation. In the case of Extra Credit's video, one such critic was EFAP's very own Rags.
Also, her legs make a swastika. Extra Credits, no.
Who responded with essentially saying, oh, so the first thing you think of when you see an orc was a black person.
You might have noticed a reoccurring argument about some species from fantasy media, specifically orcs.
Oh yeah, I remember that. A bunch of totally not racist progressive types on the internet all of a sudden started deciding that, you know what? Orcs are kind of like black people. Orcs shouldn't be like black people, all violent and barbaric and evil. Now all of us normal people heard that, and we just about lost our minds because this was one of the most low-key racist and ridiculous and horrible things that we'd ever heard, and we said no. No, I'd never thought about that. I'd never even begun to consider that might even be a thing that could be a thing. Wow, y'all are kind of terrible. If you see orcs in a fantasy setting, and your mind can't help but compare them to black people, I don't know, maybe keep that to yourself, you know? Maybe not all opinions are ones that you should share. Maybe just keep that a little secret that you never tell anyone, ever.
And you know what? It really pains me to say this, it really does. But Rags isn't entirely in bad faith here. Don't get me wrong, he's not in good faith either. He attacks the writer specifically in this video, targeting him directly. At one point that I think illustrates all of Rags' biases at the beginning, he even mocks the writer's experiences with racism, acting as though it's a hindrance to his understanding, rather than an explanation as to why it bothers him so much.
This, then, is the most important thing I can say about orcs. If we play a game, and how you or the game talk about orcs reminds me how racists talk about me, memories of racism distract me, and I cannot enjoy the game. If you like, call it a me problem, not a you problem. If you want that kind of game, cool, I just won't join you. You'll be better off without me, I'll be better off without you, not calling you racist or evil, just stating a preference. But it's better we discuss this now rather than midway through the game, yeah?
Keep all that in mind as we progress through this Extra Credits video for whom he is the author. It is incredibly enlightening, and it tells you everything that you need to know about how he sees this topic. Mr. Mendez seems like the kind of person who has developed a sort of tunnel vision after years and years and years of focus on race and the discussion of race where no such discussion is necessary or even present. He lacks the ability to compartmentalize between the fantastical and what he believes to be real. I think years and years and years of a victimization complex and seeking out such victimhood, even in fantasy settings, has colored his entire perception of these unreal worlds.
In this framework, racism is not something that we can avoid to avoid making others uncomfortable. It's something that others seek out to make themselves miserable, according to Rags.
Because you can't be empathetic to me, someone who fights racism every day. You aren't just bad at world building, you are a bad person. Because you aren't placing my feeling of oppression in the real world, be it real or imagined, with the fiction that you've created for the purpose of balance and consistency.
There is a nuanced discussion to be had here. Why is it that people, when they see an orc, immediately think it must stand in for a very specific racial demographic? It could have anything to do with the fact that the movie Bright kind of juxtaposed orcs for black people. That's an actual example of one. Bright, the movie that came out a while back on Netflix, that does conflate people in the American ghetto, specifically with African American culture, with the aesthetic, the attire, the role they play in society. That does conflate orcs with black people, specifically.
He goes outside, criticizes his neighbors for playing into gangsta stereotypes, says this,
Fairy lives don't matter today.
and crushes the fairy to death with a broom.
But it's actually one of the few that makes such a direct comparison. And call me crazy, but I don't think Max Landis should have ownership of orc writing across the board. Call me crazy. I know. Much like with Bright, there are numerous stories out there that explicitly demonize black folks by comparing them to monsters, such as the 1930 film Ingagi, a movie that spread bioessentialist conspiracy theories about Native Africans being the byproduct of interbreeding with literal apes. It was treated as scientifically accurate at the time. Ingagi was also a huge influence on a much more famous film about a giant gorilla, that being King Kong, in that without Ingagi's financial success, King Kong would never have been greenlit. Perhaps in part because of this, some film scholars over the years have read the story of King Kong as an allegory for the struggles black people go through, with them being taken from their native homes in chains and enslaved to white business owners for profit. Of course, this is an academic read of the text that some people have discussed. But this read is so popular that even Tarantino references it in Inglourious Bastards.
Als ich in Amerika ankam, wurde ich da in Ketten zur Schau gestellt.
Ja.
Bin ich die Geschichte des Negers in Amerika?
Nein.
Also dann muss ich King Kong sein.
However, a lot of people don't know this theory. When Red from OSP mentioned the King Kong allegory and discussion, people reacted as though she was saying something radical, something that no one had ever said before, even though in academia it had been discussed for almost a century by this point.
On the subject of King Kong, there's think pieces about various ways it can be interpreted, but I don't think it's exactly controversial to suggest that a movie made in the 30s about a giant savage ape who is captured by white men, transported across the ocean in chains, and then abducts a white woman could possibly have some racial coding involved. And for the sake of my comment section, please do not try to defend the political sensitivity of a movie made in 1933. Can we just accept that the giant ape is probably racist?
The point is, even though academics discuss something in theory, in conjecture, the public does not necessarily understand that concept. Rags also makes this rebuttal to extra credit.
The idea that people who play tabletop RPGs and video games are going to enact real-world hatred against black people because they saw evil orcs in a video game is some of the most insulting and asinine crap that I've ever heard. These people focus all the time on race. They see race as a key component of your very identity and who you are. They've internalized it so much that they project that onto other people. Nobody thinks this. No one thinks this. You made this shit up so that you could bitch about something. You made this up so that you could reach your spindly, nasty, gooey fingers into something that you could control.
He argues that no one ever wants to enact violence against a minority after fighting monsters in an RPG or a fantasy game, which, put that in your back pocket for a second, because when we get to the Middle Ages, that's going to be very relevant, but we'll get to that. Don't worry. For right now, though, he's not wrong. People in the modern day do not make that connection. Historically, though, is a different story, but again, we'll get there. But anyway, in most cases, with maybe Bright as the only tangible exception, the Orcs are not like Ingagi. They're not a one-to-one connection to something, right? They're not implying anything, right? So why do people think of them as black people? Where did that come from? Well, it has to do with the concept of tribal fetishism. Tribal fetishism is the idea where certain writers and artists, when trying to impress upon their audience an idea that certain people can come from an uncivilized or savage world, will just throw together clothing, piercings, and tools from civilizations they deem as lesser than themselves, more primitive.
We've improved the lives of savages all over the world.
Savages?
Not that you're a savage.
Just my people.
No.
Often, it's a combination of African and indigenous tribes, and all of it is rooted in Eurocentric worldviews, that anything farther from Europe must be uncivilized. If it's not from Western civilization, it can't be from civilization. It's a colonistic perspective from the 1700s, 1800s, that's kind of leaked its way into pop culture just through reoccurring motifs and tropes. It's ingrained in the worldview aesthetic that Europe-dominated culture tends to promote.
We'll build roads and decent houses and...
Our houses are fine.
You think that, only because you don't know any better.
But the thing about Orcs is that they were not really tribalistic originally. That's the funny thing. That was added later on. That's more thanks to Warcraft and D&D. You see, in Tolkien's world, Orcs are not presented as tribalistic. If anything, Tolkien associates Orcs with mechanical industry. Tolkien's Orcs are not tribal. They have the same general structure as the Dwarfs do in terms of their living situation. They are builders of tools. Crude tools, yes, but tools all the same. A lot of chuds online get angry at Rings of Power for having Orcs have families, but that comes from Tolkien. Tolkien's Orcs have familial bonds, and they have a sense of honor. The entire motivation of Bolg, the leader of the Northern Orcs in the Misty Mountains, during the events of The Hobbit, was to avenge his father, who Thorin Oakenshield slew at the culmination of the War of Dwarves and Elves. There's also Gorbag, a minor orc in the Two Towers, who resents how the Elves will abandon comrades in battle. That's not to say the Orcs are moral bastions, not even close, but they're not purely evil either. Tolkien believed that any sapient creature needed to have the choice to commit evil or good, and so if the Orcs were inherently evil, they could not make that choice. The choice was made for them. Therefore, were they evil at all?
In a letter written in 1954, Tolkien intentionally stopped short of calling Orcs irredeemable. They would be Morgoth's greatest sins, abuses of his highest privilege, and would be creatures begotten of sin, and naturally bad. I nearly wrote irredeemably bad, but that would be going too far, because by accepting or tolerating their making, necessary to their actual existence, even Orcs would become part of the world, which is God's, and ultimately good.
Morgoth stole the opportunity from them to commit true evil, and under Sauron, the choice was robbed even further from them through colonization and domination of their wills.
That God would tolerate that seems no worse theology than the toleration of the calculated dehumanizing of men by tyrants that goes on today. There might be other makings all the same, which were more like puppets, filled only at a distance with their maker's mind and will, or ant-like operating under direction of a queen center.
This passage early on almost seems to suggest that Tolkien was aware that some people might dehumanize Orcs the same way fascist leaders of his time dehumanized populaces in his era. This suggests that Tolkien was also aware that certain bad actors could see Orcs as a substitution for these demographics. In this sense, this draws an odd parallel to what Rag said earlier.
If you see orcs in a fantasy setting, and your mind can't help but compare them to black people, I don't know, maybe keep that to yourself, you know? Maybe not all opinions are ones that you should share. Maybe just keep that a little secret that you never tell anyone, ever.
In the quote mentioned, it seems that Tolkien is acutely aware that any bioessentialist depiction of orcs will draw a comparison between orcs and another oppressed minority.
That God would tolerate that seems no worse theology than the toleration of the calculated dehumanizing of men by tyrants that goes on today.
Inevitably. Therefore, Rags, one of the people you're talking about, it's Tolkien himself. This is why orcs are humanized throughout the works, to imply that their decisions to be evil is a choice. They can actively choose to do wrong, and thus not contradict Tolkien's Catholic worldview. It's why the War of Dwarves and Orcs, which takes place before The Hobbit, is primarily between two subterranean cultures fighting over territory and resources, and why the Dwarves are presented as morally grey in The Hobbit, with Thorin being driven by greed more than Bolg. Bolg is driven by revenge to avenge his father. Thorin wants gold. What's the more emotive, maybe even more relatable motivation? Vengeance or selfishness? The Hobbit has a lot of ambiguity that often gets glossed over, especially when you compare it to Peter Jackson's interpretation of the orcs, where the orcs in that story are subservient to the necromancer. In the books, the necromancer is a removed, distant enemy. In fact, the orcs downright hate Sauron and are not exactly all that willing to join Mordor unless conquered by that culture. Tolkien wrote several letters regarding the various influences that he drew upon to create Middle-earth and its various cultures. This is most clear in the use of language. The Dwarvish language, for example, is based on traditional Hebrew, whereas the Elvish language is, yes, there's more than one, based on everything from Latin to Finnish to Welsh and Celtic. The Black speech, which is spoken in Mordor, is based on Hurrian, a language from ancient Mesopotamia. In other words, modern-day Iraq. So are the orcs Iraqi? Well, no, because that language was forced on the orcs, and most orcs hated speaking it. That's why they don't speak it in the books and films. Orcs in the Silmarillion are shown to reject and resent both Morgoth and Sauron as leaders, but subject to their overwhelming power all the same. So, we mentioned before that all these cultures draw from some human culture, right? Well, what ethnicity are orcs based on? Well, Tolkien tells us in his letters what he based the orcs on, at least briefly. In a 1958 letter marked as Letter 210 in the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien says that orcs are squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. Tolkien said that to Europeans, the orcs would look like Mongolians. Yes, Mongolians. Not black people like Extra Critic would claim, but the Huns. Tolkien based his orcs on the Golden Horde, which were known as Urug Urus. Sounds similar to Uruk, doesn't it? Very similar, very deliberate. At least that's what they're presented as physically. They're corruptions of elves, after all, so Tolkien also thought, what's the opposite of my elves? As opposed to the elves dwelling in the surface and in the sun and in the woods, the orcs tunnel beneath the ground. They live in subterranean cultures. They exist in the darkness, as opposed to the elves which live in the light. Dark, light. That's the contrast. This is where orcs become more complicated, though, because Tolkien argued that orcs and goblins were two different translations to describe the same core creature. I think Peter Jackson kind of put more effort into differentiating goblins from orcs, physically anyway, but in Tolkien's world, they're the same creature, but just different translations of the same core root language. Remember, Tolkien was trying to argue that Middle-earth was a alternate history for the world we lived in, that this was just Earth but an older version of it. And while the different subtypes of orcs, like the Uruk, for example, goblins are very complicated as a comparison. The thing about goblins is they actually do have a history of anti-Semitism, a pretty prolific one, actually. Medieval goblins were based off numerous anti-Semitic stereotypes, from the hook noses to the obsession with gold to even, in some cases, the pointed hats that several Fae wear. Yes, this is an anti-Semitic stereotype so old that only Hebrew scholars and uncomfortable enthusiasts about World War II have ever heard of this. Jews were forced in the 13th century to wear certain clothes, including the quote-unquote Jewish hat, to identify themselves. They were also associated with the practice of blood libel, where children were drained of blood as part of some arcane ritual that brought about plague and death. Jews in part were blamed in parts of Europe for the bubonic plague for this reason. Between 1347 and 1352, it is believed that of the 363 cities with Jewish communities across Europe, half of these communities were either mass executed or kicked out of their homes, left in the streets where the plague could catch them, all in response to them being blamed for the bubonic plague. And art depicted them at this time as well as goblins. This is why when I said before that certain fantasy creatures do inspire violence against minorities, this is it. This was the example.
The idea that people who play tabletop RPGs and video games are going to enact real-world hatred against black people because they saw evil orcs in a video game is some of the most insulting and asinine crap that I've ever heard.
Because many Jewish people found themselves the recipient of cruelty at the hands of those who blamed them for the plague. Likewise, goblins and other fae were accused of stealing children for arcane rituals, which seems like a direct parallel to the practices of blood libel. However, that's not to say anyone who uses a goblin or pointy hats is being actively anti-Semitic. Far from it. It all depends on how they're used. The pointy hat, for example, was seen as a symbol of both the Jewish people in the Middle Ages as well as criminals and shady characters. And this has to do with how in the 14th century, all usurers were forced to wear pointy hats, which included those who practiced sorcery. This is why the pointy hat becomes associated with wizards and sorcerers like Merlin and Gandalf, as well as witches like the Wicked Witch from the West. All of it has a common ancestry to real history. But the thing is, like with most of these cases, everyone kind of forgot the source of that information. It was passed down in iconography. Give it a few hundred years, what would it come from? You don't remember that. So there is no intended malice when you use a pointy hat. It's not like you're being actively anti-Semitic. You just don't know. And that's a key element. Likewise, many goblins were seen as greedy and gold-obsessed as a parallel to anti-Semitic stereotypes. But as discussions of this became more prolific, many writers opted to separate their works from the anti-Semitic origins that these goblins drew from. One such person was Tolkien himself. Tolkien drew from Hebrew and the Jewish culture when developing his dwarves, but he made conscious efforts after The Hobbit to present dwarves in a fashion that didn't draw comparisons to anti-Semitic stereotypes. This is especially true after he learned that certain Nazis cited Tolkien's dwarves as an example of the problems they noticed with, you get the idea. Tolkien was not happy with this comparison because, like most people who have common sense, he did not want those people as his fans, and made great efforts to improve his representation. That's why Gimli in The Lord of the Rings is such a noble, noteworthy, charismatic figure. And I think the movies kind of reduce that a little bit, but again, the films are fantastic. Gimli is still a fantastic character.
The dwarves, of course, quite obviously, couldn't you say in many ways they remind you of the Jews? All their words are Semitic, obviously, and constructed to be Semitic. There's a tremendous love of the artifact, and of course the immense warlike capacity the Jews do, which we tend to forget nowadays. Hobbits are just rustic English people, made small in size because it reflects the general small reach of their imagination, but it's not the small reach of their courage or latent power.
But it's strange, isn't it? We make such a big deal when orcs are compared to certain racial minorities, but not dwarves. Well, I'm sure there's nothing really to that. That won't tie into my conclusion at all, I'm sure. Nowadays, most fantasy writers are aware of the implications of greedy goblins and try to avoid any references to them. Pathfinder, for example, has goblins that aren't greedy, but rather pyromaniacs who delight in chaos. They're also cute and small and without big noses, but have massive bat-like ears. Others use goblins as nebulous, chaotic monsters who are more interested in carnage than greed. Many also kind of use kobolds as a substitute for goblins to disassociate themselves further from that kind of iconography. But there is one noteworthy exception, of course.
Have you ever seen a Harry Potter movie? And people are all like, I love the Harry Potter movies. Like, you ever see the scenes in Gringotts Bank? And they're like, I love the scenes in Gringotts Bank. He's like, do you know what those folks that run the bank are? And they're like, what? And they're like, Jews. From, it's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I just want to show you a caricature. And they're like, oh, look at that. That's from Harry Potter. And you're like, no, that's a caricature of a Jew from an anti-Semitic piece of literature. J.K. Rowling was like, can we get these guys to run our bank?
Besides, orcs and the stereotypical goblins have little in common with each other. Orcs don't have the traditionally anti-Semitic physical features, like, say, the pointed nose, or even greed for gold. Orcs don't have much value for gold. In fact, orcs hate dwarves, who draw heavily from the Jewish culture. However, that's not to say that Tolkien's hands are totally clean of not relying on racist imagery, because he based them on Mongolians. Tolkien was a British man who grew up at the end of British colonialism. I don't believe he was actively being racist, but bigoted ideas were normalized in his time. Yeah, the man was embraced by 60s counterculture, but he also believed that order could be established by the arrival of a good king. He was, in many ways, a conservative Catholic man, and this influences his art. Tolkien's art is a product of its time, but it's arguably the best possible version of that work that we could have gotten at that time. But the thing about orcs is that the more often they showed up, the more they shifted from Tolkien's original version. Hell, the versions of orcs we see in Peter Jackson's trilogy of Lord of the Rings are vastly removed from the original version of orcs in the books. In the books, they're short, bow-legged, and have some degree of honor among themselves. Keep in mind, in the books, Sam and Frodo are able to successfully disguise themselves as orcs without arousing suspicion, because orcs and hobbits were similarly sized and proportioned, at least some of the orcs. The Uruks are a little different. Now, when we get to Dungeons and Dragons, it gets really interesting, because this is the first big transformation of orcs. You see, we have the creation of the orc god, whose people were given no home, and thus the orcs wander across the planet, living everywhere and settling nowhere. This explains why orcs are omnipresent characters, but also why they have no home country or no home culture, at least at this stage of D&D. Now, when D&D first came out, Gary Gygax reimagined orcs. They went from tiny little gremlins to broad-shouldered, pig-like creatures. And a number of fantasy games at the time were inspired by this depiction and similarly depicted orcs as pig-like. And these games became popular in Japan, especially. The Moblins in Zelda, they're orcs, basically. The orcs in Delicious in Dungeon, why are they pig-like? It comes from 1st edition D&D. Later editions changed this, but anyone who acts like there's some purity to how orcs were originally depicted in D&D, well, do you have your orcs be like pigs, or more like Warcraft orcs? They're more like Warcraft orcs, I'm sure. So, unless you want to swear complete fealty to the original versions of orcs in D&D, everything you've ever roleplayed as in a game has shifted from where orcs started. Anyone who complains about orc purity in terms of tabletop RPGs or video games, you're basing that off a version of orcs that's way more recent in memory than the orcs you think of. I think our modern idea of orcs has more to do with World of Warcraft and Peter Jackson than Tolkien. If only because WoW established the idea of these hulking, barbaric warrior orcs, more in line with Klingons, really, than the little goblin people from the original novels. Orcs in WoW are from another planet entirely, known as Draenor, formerly slaves to the Ogryn and enemies of the Ogres, before rising to power, due not to strength, but intelligence and strategy. Again, orcs associate not with brute force and idiocy, but rather clever planning, something again similar to what Tolkien did, but taken to a new, more overt level. We'll come back to ogres and trolls being foolish and dumb in a second as well. Also, orcs are heavily involved in shamanistic magic, which feeds more into tribalism and tribalistic stereotypes. They're also manipulated by a demon lord into starting a war with the Draenei and later humanity in Azeroth. This also results in orcs going from grey and dark-skinned to green-skinned. And if I'm being honest, I kind of prefer orcs with green skin. It seems like overlord manipulation with orcs is a common component of fantasy literature, that the orcs aren't really inherently bad, but they're being used or played by someone else. I don't know what that really says about us with orcs. I don't know. Maybe we don't have some element of tragedy to their situation. Maybe we want to kind of remove them as like the big evil. Maybe it's because we can't think of them as the singular big villain like we do in The Hobbit, or capable of forming strategies. Maybe it's an idea of colonization, what is another force that's manipulating and using smaller races as a tool. Maybe we're just like orcs as henchmen. I don't really know for sure, but it's a reoccurring trope in a lot of the early orc fiction. Another thing that WoW helped popularize was the concept of the physically different male orc versus female orc. As you can see clearly from here, there is a distinct difference between how a male orc looks and how a female orc looks. This kind of gave rise to a common joke that female variants of monster races were more humanoid than their male counterparts. Again, in Warcraft especially, some orcs like Duratan and Thrall, they're presented as righteous orcs with a semblance of honor, which was the first major step in mainstream fantasy of making orcs heroic, someone that audiences could love. And by contrast, they also made human society more than a little morally gray. They included elements of persecution to add ambiguity to the sides, to make it so that you had to choose a perspective to side with. Audiences could say which side they had more respect for, which side had the better point, and they made it more ambiguous. I think Warcraft, as it went to more unambiguously evil threats, but in the early days of Warcraft, both sides had their hands dirty, and that made it interesting. But over time, orcs became more sympathetic. With each iteration, people wanted to play orcs more and more in games. We wanted to see more stories about orcs, and as a result, some writers went, well, what if some orcs aren't evil? Now, one major work that helped promote the idea of the sympathetic orc, that is often overlooked today especially, is Stan Nichols' Orc, First Blood. It is one of the first stories to center orcs in a large fantasy narrative. Now, one interesting idea is that the various races in fantasy exist in segregated universes that have blended together, resulting in cultures that should not cross, integrating. We'll come back to that integration much later. Books like Dungeons and Lattes, for example, presents an orc woman who, tired of fighting and all this carnage, opens up a coffee shop with a succubus, and they just have a good, pleasant time. And it's just pleasant and warm and fuzzy, an orc capable of warmth, empathy, kindness. However, this might have been too much for some people, because some people got really angry that orcs were no longer monsters, that they were no longer the evil henchmen. Even though this had been happening gradually over the course of decades, they would look at where orcs started and look at where orcs ended up and go, how do we get here? What was the transition point like this? When did orcs become just like anyone else in the fantasy world? And this is where things get complicated. A recent controversy involved the 2024 update to Dungeons & Dragons, where orcs are now a playable race. In art in the books, as well as in the lore, orcs are now migrants, wandering around the countryside. Art depicted them kind of in a Wild West setting at one point, wearing frontiersman outfits. In some cases, some of the attire resembled that of the Mexican immigrant. Except, in the Old West, many Mexicans were displaced people following the Mexican-American War, redrawing the map between those two countries. So, orcs being similar to a real-life displaced people is logical. And then there's Warhammer orcs. I'm not the biggest Warhammer expert, so I won't speak too much on this, but I know enough about orcs to know they're awesome. They can just rewrite reality if they believe hard enough. Like, they believe certain colors have magical powers inherently. That's great. It's also completely divorced from Tolkien's version of orcs. It gets to the point where orcs are widely reinterpreted from one media to another media. So any idea that orcs all represent black people, like Extra Credit said originally, it's absurd. They're all so different. Each one is completely reinvented by the creatives involved. To call them one culture is reductive. The orcs from Bright are nothing like the orcs from Lord of the Rings, and the orcs from Warhammer are nothing like the orcs from Lord of the Rings. It's baffling for anyone could ever argue all orcs are like this, because it's simply not the case. You cannot have a broad stroke here. You have to look at each one on a case-by-case basis. Maybe the writer is racist and used his racist ideology in the work, but that's a one-off situation that requires you to look at the work specifically that you're talking about and analyze the work, how it specifically is written, or how that game is specifically developed. We want easy answers, I think, in certain parts of the internet, and this pursuit of simplicity results in us being lazy with our analysis and making generalizations that might hurt people. However, that does not mean that orcs aren't applicable to the Black experience. After all, an orc might not be written with that in mind, but if a Black audience member watched a show with an orc and went, oh, this is similar to my struggles, well, there you go. That's applicability. And that's something Tolkien promoted. Tolkien hated direct allegory, but he loved when readers brought their own life experience to a work. So it also stands to reason that as readers put their own life experience to the works of Tolkien and Warcraft and D&D, that they themselves might then create works that reflect their life experience. Why wouldn't a displaced Mexican person relate to a displaced people in fiction? It stands to reason that if you make something, it reflects your life experience. So what is it that people like Rags were so upset by? Was it the idea that they didn't want to see the orcs in other mediums be altered or shifted? Or because they don't want you to relate to these characters that they want to mow down in mass? Or maybe they just don't want you talking about it. But what about when fans are being racist about creatures in fantasy? Well, that's not to say that goblins are being used to justify modern-day anti-Semitism, because anyone can really do that if you really try hard enough. Again, broad strokes, you can do anything you want to dehumanize the people you're bigoted against. But rather, do fans express racist inclinations based on how they talk about fantasy races? When they talk about specific races in fantasy, are they kind of overplaying their hand, revealing their own real-world biases with how they talk about racism?
For the simple reason that our worldviews are just simply 100% anathema to one another. Completely opposed, utterly impossible to mix. Our worldviews are so far separate that our aesthetic tastes are quite literally guts and glory contra gay race.
I'm having a hard time really following where his disagreement is, because he seems to be very focused on making sure he remembers to do the accent.
Well, the thing is, a lot of times you see fantasy fans dehumanizing monsters more and more. Now, people are clearly intended to empathize with certain orcs in media. Compare early D&D orcs, the ones in Delicious and Dungeon. There's humanity there. Or Warcraft, for that matter. However, people don't really do that with trolls or zombies or ogres because they're more monstrous. Again, not no one does it, but it's less common. So the more monstrous the race becomes, the more people treat them more like beasts. And that's interesting. You see this sometimes in media where people project identity onto a somewhat formless canvas. Take the Bugs from Starship Troopers. The Bugs, an alien race that the Earth is fighting against, unite the planet, essentially in a singular war. Audiences may try to read the Bugs as some real-world target of the military machine, which is honestly reductive. The Bugs don't represent one target of military aggression in real life. They're not a race based on anything but actual bugs. They're a collectivist animal creature, you know? They are a stand-in for any population. A military dehumanizes and demonizes in propaganda, treating people like bugs.
Frankly, I find the idea of a bug that thinks offensive.
But are they specific people? Well, not really. That's for your own interpretation to bring, and that's applicability, not allegory. But the easy counter-argument is, if you apply Starship Troopers to any military conflict, folks who just want a reductive argument will just go, oh, so you see those people as bugs, huh? Because they just want you to shut up and talk about how cool it is to fight the monsters. It is impossible to empathize with the bugs by design. There's no conversations between them, no familial relationships, no sense of honor or industry, because the bugs are just a stand-in. Your attention should be on the government projecting everything, even a meteor impact on the bugs to motivate people to fight the war and not look at the government as it continues taking more and more power from the people. The bugs are incidental. It's our human obsession with them that makes it interesting. D&D in particular has several evil races, such as the Illithids, which are profoundly unnatural and alien. Baldur's Gate 3 goes out of its way to show how potentially some Illithids are sympathetic, but only a couple. Okay, really just one. Umulum is presented as, well, maybe not good, but certainly not overwhelmingly evil and malignant.
In the beginning, I had an arrangement with a lich. I required brains. He required souls. I wished to better the world, and he preferred its rot.
Most exist as part of a hive mind, and all lack a soul. They feed on brains and reproduce by transforming a living creature's body into one of their own. Every agenda they have is to further the influence of their empire, which does include enslaving lesser races. Lesser by their standards, anyway.
Perhaps the peoples of the Underdark will be less inclined to violence if they comprehend the cost, yes?
By all accounts, they want to consume and manipulate everything. So, you don't mind fighting them. Defeating the Illithid is an existential threat, not an ethical one. Similarly, demons in Freyren are predatory animals. They only feign humanity to lure in victims they can slaughter. They're an existential threat, and thus must be fought. Now, are either Illithids or Freyren's demons evil? Well, who's to really say? Is a cat evil for preying on mice? But they are a threat, so their morality doesn't really matter. It's kill or be killed, and that makes it interesting. It's a fight for survival, both on an existential level and a physical one. Demons in Freyren in particular are interesting in that they authentically cannot feel guilt or malice. They are just natural predators. Even the big bad demon lord Freyren, Himmel, and the others defeated prior to the story starting sought to figure out a way to coexist with humanity. But much like Jack Skellington trying to do a Christmas, he made a small error here and there and killed 1/3 of the human population. Demons aren't incapable of trying to do good. They just suck at it. Trusting a demon is as effective as trusting a crocodile in the Nile with your foot. You project what you want to see from the animal onto it, but the more you think you understand how its reptilian brain functions, the less you really do. In Baldur's Gate 3, though, you have the Emperor, a character who seemingly has humanity's best wishes in mind, but manipulates you, enslaves a Githyanki hero, and the moment he is inconvenienced, turns on his allies. He demands total obedience, or will outright kill you, or enslave you, or encourage you to put brainworms in your head so you become another mind flayer. Demons and Illithids are horrifying because they are totally, completely alien to our morality. However, you will still see some people online argue that it is immoral to dislike how Freyren and D&D handle these existential threats. But I don't really buy these arguments. It's not impossible for demons to be good, but the path towards that goodness involves bloodshed, involves pain. Demons in Freyren are nothing like orcs, even in Middle-earth. Orc culture is, even in its inception, vastly more complex and self-contradictory by nature of being realistic. Strength is a merit. They're a warrior class, depending on what culture you're talking about. It would be like comparing in Star Trek the warrior Klingons to the Borg. They're just not comparable. But I mean, it's not really comparable to orcs anyway. I mean, no one's saying the demons in Freyren are like any real-world population, right? Foreshadowing is a technique that indicates, but moving away from monsters, we do see racism exist in-universe in many fantasy worlds. Tieflings, for example, from D&D, first introduced in 2nd edition, face discrimination due to the nature of their birth. Tieflings are born because someone in their past made a pact with a fiend or had some infusion of devilish energy, maybe through intercourse, one might say. centuries if not millennia in the past. It's no fault of an individual tiefling's own that they're born with this. Yet, because of the circumstance of their birth, they face discrimination. They were, like orcs, once written as always evil before being humanized gradually. Between Critical Role's Jester and Baldur's Gate's Karlach, tieflings have seen a massive rise in popularity.
She looks like she could throw me over her shoulder and carry me to safety, should the need arise.
Especially among marginalized audiences, who can relate to being dehumanized unfairly. But a lot of fans kind of miss them being an evil race, even though the circumstances of their birth open them up to choose to be good or evil. The choice is removed from tieflings in some circles of the fandom. And that because of that, it's kind of weird, isn't it? There's no existential reason that they have to fight. They can embrace their evil history or choose to live lives on their own terms. So why do we get upset when that option of choice is given to the players? But these make sense. Again, people want to humanize races and species that are perceived as evil or even play as them because it offers a creative option to show pushing against stereotypes or maybe to defy the stereotypes of an otherwise really cool concept.
You, step back! We'll not tolerate Drow in here.
One of D&D's first token good members of a quote-unquote evil race is one of the most popular D&D characters ever created, Drizzt Do'Urden. Drizzt is raised in Menza Berenzin, the city-state run by the Drow under the authority of Lolth, the Spider Queen. However, he rebels against his city's culture of cutthroat cruelty and betrayal, as well as bigotry, and rises first through the tunnels of the Underdark before joining the surface world, settling in a remote region of Icewind Dale, the only place an outsider like him can find a community who welcomes him without fear. Drow are presented as an evil counterpart to elves, dark reflections who, over time, became increasingly sympathetic to audiences, to the point where, eventually, they changed the culture so players would be more welcomed to play them. In fact, over time, D&D has moved away from traits being inherent to your race or species. Your background ends up influencing your nature more, your playstyle more, your stats more, which on one hand forces you to consider the character's backstory and how that influences what you're playing. It focuses on how your character has grown to develop certain skills rather than being born with certain skills. They still have racial traits, but it's de-emphasized a bit. I don't know, does that remove the conceptual difference between certain species? Like, a tiefling and a human are physically different. Should we really ignore all the differences possible? It removes relatively little of the mechanisms of character development. It also helps reduce min-maxing, I think, which, good. Then again, gamers get angry whenever any options are presented that are different from what came before. Further customization in various games has caused people to get angry, even body sliders in Dragon Age. If it falls outside the metrics of the narrative and it's extra, you find people get upset. Even when it's in the narrative, they get upset.
This last week, things must have been exceptionally slow at the Grift Factory because a subsection of the social media sphere had a collective aneurysm when Wizards of the Coast released this seemingly innocuous promotional image for Dungeons & Dragons, encouraging anyone to be able to tell their own story. But if you think this is just a promotional image, not even affixed to any particular product, just a brand, you must be sorely mistaken, judging by the reaction from a certain group of very angry people. According to them, this image is several other things. It's evidence that hobbies must be gatekept, that LGBTQ people are subversives trying to infiltrate and overtake these hollowed spaces. It's DEI nobody wanted, and most importantly, it does not represent the real gamers who play Dungeons & Dragons because they would never have kobolds having fun, and they would never fall in love, certainly. And as I dug more into this phenomenon of critique, these are opinions, and opinions like them have been repeated ad nauseum, seemingly copied and pasted across various forums, well before even this piece of promotional art.
A lot of players got very angry when D&D presented the option to play a gay character, which I find bizarre. First off, gay people play tabletop RPGs. I don't know what to tell you. Secondly, there's an entire mechanic in the older versions of D&D that allow you to have different species breed and affect the stats you get depending on how your cross-species character exists, your bispecial character. So we can have stats about how elves and dwarves can reproduce, but 2 gay characters is too much for you, even though you're not forced to do it. Seems a little hypocritical to me, I personally think, but what are you gonna do? But getting back to orcs, all this kind of shows that everything in fantasy is flexible. Any creative decision can change the world of your fantasy universe in any way. Tolkien orcs are different than Warcraft orcs, which are different from Warhammer orcs, which are different from Japanese orcs. Tolkien elves are different from the fair folks of folklore or the Christmas elves you see every season. No, changing orcs is not the death of creativity or restriction. It's just what we've been doing this entire time. Making a monster into a race with complex rules and systems isn't a deconstruction of that monster race, it's just a choice. But it's through a different fantasy race that we might see the inflexibility of certain people to adjust. Elves are closer to nature, wiser, taller, thinner, and granted with preternatural or even supernatural abilities. And in Tolkien's world, they cannot die of old age and possess eternal youth. Unlike orcs, which can be perceived as racist due to them having some tribalistic tendencies or representing some kind of racial minority, elves exist as an elevated version of the perfect man, something beyond man in some way. Now, Tolkien's elves, in particular, represent a hierarchy of power that has waned and collapsed over time, due in part to his model of history as one long defeat. Each age in Middle-earth is diminished from the last, the further we move away from creation. Elves leaving Middle-earth towards the end of the Third Age represent society's descent from the glory of the past into an industrialized modernity. One of the first big changes made to elves and other fantasy stories is that rather than be eternally youthful, they just age slower than most people, and sometimes extremely so. Elves think they're better than all the other races. Famously, they have rivalries with dwarves, though again, this is amped up more in the Peter Jackson films than in the books, and they hate orcs, as does everyone else apparently. The elves witness the failures of men throughout history and conclude, well, mankind sucks, and in fairness, are they all that wrong? On the other hand, in D&D, elves are believed to have origins with the Feywild, in the form of the Eladrin, the pure elves. Many of them travel into our material plane and assimilate into our reality. I kind of love the Eladrin because they feel more otherworldly than normal D&D elves, having states that correlate to the seasons, being tied in with nature more. I think that's kind of neat and cool. I don't know, I like them. There are several varieties of elves in D&D. High elves, wood elves, and the Drow are just the most popular kinds, but you also got sea elves, sun elves, moon elves, etc. And all of them have some iteration in Tolkien's world, at least the first they mentioned. Yeah, dark elves exist in Tolkien's Middle-earth, I bet you didn't know that. The wood elves are closer to nature, the high elves feel more like gods among men, and the dark elves basically are elves that embrace the darkness, usually subterranean darkness. And they are also the only ones that are distinctly dark-skinned, at least until more modern versions of D&D and fantasy stories had darker-skinned elves. You see, here's the issue. Maybe the orcs aren't considered to be black people, but elves that have black skin are treated as evil in a lot of early D&D. Granted, over time they made it more purple skin, more alien-looking hue, so it wasn't a one-to-one, but it's hard not to kind of draw that connection that some games might have implied something else, might have projected their own bigotries onto the Drow. But please, don't take my word for it. Take the word of R.A. Salvatore, the creator of Drizzt Do'Urden and one of the main writers for the Forgotten Realms. In a 2014 interview with Escapist magazine that was cited in the aforementioned article cited on the screen right here, he says, "One of the things that intrigues me about fantasy is that it is racist. You're not talking about humans, so I guess you can get away with it. Orcs are supposed to be the embodiment of evil in fantasy. It started many years ago when I wrote the short story Dark Mirror, where Drizzt runs into a goblin. He finds out the goblin is an escaped slave. The goblin seems like a great guy, and Drizzt wants to believe that, because he isn't what people expect from a dark elf. In fantasy, you embody evil in a race, And then you disembody it with your sword. And that's also what mankind has done throughout the centuries, right? By dehumanizing the enemy so you don't feel bad about killing them. But that's just blatantly immoral when you get right down to it. And yet I love fantasy. So that's the paradox I have to deal with. There are elements at play that can lend itself to that read. That's not to say it is that, but I am saying that some players might have projected their own internal bigotries onto the Drow. Potentially. There is the option. Not saying they did it, but they could have. And it's not just Drow that have these physical features you can apply to certain bigotries, because the rest of the elves have them too. And unlike the Drow, there's more going on here. So, let's talk about the Thule Society. The Thule Society was an esoteric order in the early 20th century that drew from the ancient Greek myths of Hyboria, an ancient land from which all Europeans supposedly came from. These ancient myths had a massive influence on many fantasy writers of the early 20th century, especially Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan, as well as Tolkien. Mind you, they drew from the myth, the Greek myth, not what the Thule Society was presenting, because the Thule Society took the myth in a very different, very real direction. Now, the Thule Society, however, twisted this into arguing that the masters of Europe came from some forgotten ancient society that all Western civilization came from. A heightened world of tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white people. An Aryan society, one might say. Yeah, you see where this is going, right? Elves are traditionally depicted as a Scandinavian culture. Pale, blonde, blue eyes, objectively beautiful, a perfect race. And the bad elves are dark-skinned. And the evil races in fantasy, well, they're corruption of elves, a decay of elves, their total inverse. And it's totally fine to kill them all one by one until nothing remains. It doesn't help how many elves in fantasy are typically on the force of justice and right, like in Tolkien's world, like Christopher Paolini's Inheritance Cycle. The elves are the good guys. They're a force of light, brightness, restoring civilization to a world that's been ruled by some dark force. This is also why there's so few elves in Lord of the Rings proper. They exist as a haunting remnant of a time more glamorous in the past. Their absence makes it feel like we're at a disadvantage in a world falling from grace. Dragon Age, on the other hand, has elves as these past society, a quote-unquote perfect higher order that committed a lot of crimes, of course, that have influenced modern perspectives, but again, they were the dominant society, whereas modern elves are a diminished people. Second-class citizens, ostracized and persecuted by human culture. And them removed from their height makes them more interesting. There's a legendary version of what elves were, and a cold reality of what they are. The fantasy versus the cold reality. One thing I want to focus on, though, with D&D in particular, is how elves are framed in the greater narrative, especially in the Forgotten Realms. Elves are just one creature that has long life in this world, not the only one. Elves in the surface world are one of many long-lived societies and creatures. Some integrate with the rest of culture, others remain isolated. The Drow of the Underdark often hold dominion over great underground cities, but are really only united in their hatred of the surface world. They backstab each other all the time. And until recent additions, which added that some Drow don't even hate the surface world, they're just underground. But even then, Illithids hold huge sway over Drow enclaves. Memorably in the Dark Elf trilogy, the Illithid Mithiel el Videnvelp is used as a sort of double agent for House Bunray, both as an asset for the Drow matriarch, as well as a means for the Illithids to influence Menza Berenzin from within. In this sense, the Drow and the Illithids are both shown to be equally dangerous threats in the Underdark, with both influencing the other for their own selfish intent. Neither is presented as the supreme leader in this sense. Just one of many. All that to say is that even with the unintentional implications, there are ways to write elves that do not fall into these traps. My favorite depiction of elves, personally, are the ones that focus on their extended lifespans, how unbelievably long life impacts them, or as chaotic entities that are twisted by an alien set of morals and ideals tied with nature. Or Drow. I love Drow. Drow are fantastic. I love the whole subterranean culture, the backstabbing. I love that they worship a giant god of betrayal and horror named Lolth. I love the Driders, and I love Drist as a character too. Someone who overcomes the evil nature of his culture through great personal effort, almost being driven to madness by his experiences escaping Menzoberranzan, only to emerge as a hero, one at a disadvantage, one who encounters bigotry for his being. It's fascinating. It's a really interesting kind of narrative and framework to work with. Of course, another point worth discussing with the 2024 update to D&D, when it reinvented both Orcs and Drow, they tried to soften the always evil nature of both. With Orcs, they made them a nomadic people, sure, and folks were pretty mad, even though Orcs had always been a people without a country, and that was a core element of their characteristic. But at least they added something with what they changed. With the Drow, they took away the evil history of their people and replaced it with nothing. While Menzoberranzan still exists, it's an evil city-state in and of itself, not all Drow culture. So what's beyond all that? Well, not much. Drow culture outside of Menzoberranzan is nebulous. So at least with Orcs, they added something with what they changed. With other evil races, they were not so lucky. I feel a lot of the great depictions of immortality in fantasy lift heavily from Peter S. Beagle's The Last Unicorn, a story that depicts how long life can isolate you from the rest of the world, detach you from moral experiences, and perhaps mortality is necessary in order to appreciate the fleeting beauty of life.
And where were you 20 years ago? 10 years ago? Where were you when I was new?
In this sense, Freyrin has some of the best depictions of elves I've ever seen. I know anime has a ton of great elves, from Record of Lodoss War's Deedlit to Delicious in Dungeons' Marcel, but Freyrin is just such a fascinating, tragic character, one who pursues knowledge and knowing, looking at life in terms of decades rather than seconds, but she is acutely aware of the disconnect she experiences from the rest of the world around her. Functioning as a mountain, the whole story is initiated because, in a relative blink of an eye, she realizes she missed out on the lives of her companions that she fought alongside for a decade.
人間の寿命は短いって分かっていたのに知ろうと思わなかったんだろう。
And that absence, and that loss, weighs upon her, forces her to confront the ephemeral nature of life and her relationship with a changing world, one changing so fast relative to her, a stationary, everlasting figure. How in seemingly moments all traces of the person she cared about, in ways she doesn't quite understand yet, are just gone, or something builds upon it, and she can't go back. Freyrin has elves in short supply, but unlike Tolkien's world, where elves are departing, or in Dragon Age, where the elves have essentially fallen from grace, elves in Freyrin have no immediate interest in reproduction, with their long lives skewing their priorities. As a result, they're actually dying out, due not to some outside circumstance, but to their own negligence, leaving Freyrin, remarkably, few people left who share her viewpoint on time and life. Again, much like The Last Unicorn.
I can feel this body dying all around me.
There's immense tragedy to the very things that other writers might frame as positives. It begs the question, who really wants to live forever? A similar fate befalls Marcel in Delicious in Dungeon, who is granted extended life as a result of being a half-elf, and is very well aware that she will long outlive all her friends and companions, and that weighs heavily on her. The difference here is that Marcel is young, Freyrin's old. The perspective of eternal life is different. The prospect of eternal life, or an experienced eternal life. And there's the other side of anime, which just takes the shit out of elves, Elves, are they otaku or obese, Japanese media has such an irreverence for elves that I kind of admire. I love how they're willing to take these things that we in Western culture, admire and hold up all the time, but then they're like, yeah, fuck them. Let's make them look ridiculous. Or alternatively, in Legend of Zelda, many races are based on elves, especially the Hylians, and they just sort of become the base human form. You know, they take something that is higher and make it regular, and then just say that's where we're starting from. All pointed ears. Let's keep going. What's so stunning, though, is Freyrin has such a wonderful world where a character learns beyond her experience, goes out of her way to find new things, to develop and grow despite such a long life, and yet the people online seem to only care about one thing, that Freyrin really hates demons. They ignore the parts where Freyrin tries to understand human experience, tries to learn about new cultures, new societies, new things, and instead just focus on, no, it's the demons. That's her sole character trait worth discussing. A lot of people have used Freyrin as a symbol of their own bigotries towards different people. And you can tell how artificial this is whenever a story shows demons in a sympathetic light. Case in point, Demon Slayer, one of the most popular anime of all time, has received a lot of criticism from a certain subset of Freyrin fans for choosing to be sympathetic towards demons, even though, fundamentally, Demon Slayer's demons and Freyrin's demons are so completely different on a fundamental world-building level, and yet you see folks like this argue that it's bad, actually. And I'm sure this guy is a stand-up citizen who has no issues or problematic feelings in his real-world life at all. Who's this guy? Let's take a look at him. I'm sure nothing bad.
Hello everyone, my name is Kongmin Lee, and I was just fired from my job for my conservative beliefs. The main reason? Because my posts were dehumanizing and derogatory.
It's clear to us that your commentary invokes language that's derogatory and dehumanizing.
So what specifically?
Well, how about yesterday when you implied that women shouldn't have the right to vote and that women are hags, miserable people, birthers, and psychopaths?
I didn't call women that.
Yes, you did. It's very clear. We have evidence of it. Your language is dehumanizing. You target every kind of identity that's represented. I'm embarrassed that we're just realizing it.
When you see posts like what Kongmin Lee posted, you gotta remember the biases that go into it. When you listen to Rags talk, you need to know the biases going into it. What perspectives do they have? The idea that these people are motivated by fantasy literature is ridiculous. Demon Slayer does not motivate someone to be a bigot, nor does killing orcs in a video game make you one. But if you're fiercely protective of this mentality, of these demons being pure evil, maybe there's something else you're talking about. Maybe it's not the media that's the problem, it's just you. I just want to remind you of this quote. In fantasy, you embody evil in a race, and then you disembody it with your sword, and that's also what mankind has done throughout the centuries, right? By dehumanizing the enemy so you don't feel bad about killing them. But that's just blatantly immoral when you get right down to it. And yet I love fantasy, so that's the paradox I have to deal with. But that begs the question, what about humanity in all this, right? I mean, Legend of Zelda has no normal people. The Hylians are normal people, really. With orcs, they feel like they're these powerful things, and elves are wise beyond their years, but what relevancy does humanity have in fantasy? A lot of people have thoughts on how humans function in fantasy, but the voice I want to highlight in this regard is none other than Lily Orchard's take on this. Lily Orchard has put to words all the worst ideas floating around online and coalesced them into one video. Yes, Lily Orchard somehow has returned into this discussion because Lily has the belief in all fantasy that humans are the sole problem for everything that goes wrong.
Why are humans so frequently the worst race in any fantasy game? Fantasy races are pretty much the lifeblood of fantasy games, as the ability to insert yourself into a fantastical world of wonder involves being able to insert yourself into a culture that lives in that world. But fantasy games have long struggled with the big three: humans, elves, and dwarves. Dwarves are usually the easiest ones. They live underground, they drink, they mine, they might be made of rocks, and they're all Scottish, except in Dragon Age where they're all American and have a really intricate bureaucracy. Elves have only two modes. In Lord of the Rings, they're otherworldly creatures who are so long-lived that they have surpassed literally everything else on the planet, and so they all leave to go do something else. And then in every other piece of fantasy media, they're minoritized and subject to genocide upon genocide because Lord of the Rings tweaked the worst kind of fantasy bitch.
Yep, Tolkien in this story didn't tell stories about little people like hobbits being the forces that changed the course of history. No. He wasn't focusing on small people. He should have focused on the more powerful ones, the more spectacular ones, the flashier ones. He didn't focus on humanity taking reins of a world far larger than themselves and finding a way to maintain it regardless through a respect of the old ways. No. Humanity is just the problem. That's always the case.
And then you have the humans, who are nothing. If there's ever been one constant throughout the fantasy genre, it's that humans are simultaneously omnipresent, the most powerful and widespread race in the land, and they're also an underdeveloped culturalist vacuum who are at best defined by mercantilism and at worst defined by racism.
Likewise, Lily reframes humanity as accountable for everything that goes wrong. In Azeroth, for example, in the war against the Horde.
World of Warcraft is probably the worst offender for how bad fantasy is at making humans interesting. Oh sure, there have been plenty of human characters all over the story, but they're all lone wolves. Human-run organizations tend to be militant and aggressive, especially when it comes to a culture or race they look down on, which is all of them. Human aggression is the primary reason for most of the Horde's members joining the Horde in the first place.
Humanity's persecution of the other races drives them to the Horde. Now, undeniably, the kingdoms of humanity have committed several atrocities. We mentioned that at the start of the video. But humanity in Warcraft is ultimately tribal. Part of the story's appeal is it humanizes what we consider to be monsters, and it shows the moral greenness and tribalism of the shining heroes we would normally associate with civilization.
But WoW's writing is weird. Over the years, writers have gotten really into the idea of the Alliance as the friend-making peacemongers, but they don't so much dial back Alliance aggression as they do make excuses for it. Throughout the story, human aggression is often completely forgotten about when the writers want their precious Uwu baby boy to play peacemonger.
It's meant to add nuance. Any reading of "this group is all evil" is reductive by the nature of the story.
Blizzard's writers have no idea what they want the humans to be and just slap very generic concepts onto them. They're either generically good or they're Klansmen.
In other words, this is a basic Lily Orchard take that reflects the knee-jerk trend among fantasy audiences to search for a basic good guy, bad guy narrative. Now, Lily also runs defense for her elf favorite, Sylvanas Windrunner.
For example, Garrosh is often blamed for fomenting war in Cataclysm, but that war was started an expansion prior by Varian Rin, who attempted to murder both Thrall and Sylvanas for crimes they didn't commit. Several expansions later, Sylvanas is given an entire villain arc surrounding the Fourth War, when that war was started by Gen attempting to murder the Horde's war chief for a crime she didn't commit, and also Kalia Menethil completely sabotaging a genuine attempt at mending that bridge at the Gathering in the following novel. In both these cases, the Horde's war chief is given the villain arc for a war the Alliance started.
Sylvanas is tragic, yeah, but Lily frames her as doing no wrong, even though one of her later motivations was to offer the souls of those slain in war to the jailer Zoval. Just innocent girl stuff. She's innocent of that. In fact, she chose to serve a demon. Lily also sees culture in D&D as inherently race-based rather than culture-based.
All of the examples I've shown tend to have no idea what their culture is, but WoW's humans exist in a complete cultureless void. D&D isn't as egregious with humans, but humans often have such little identity that players who make humans have to do triple the work to make their characters interesting, because they can't just fall back on, lol, I'm a faith hippo named Bardy McBardfaith. And that's because for much of the game's lifespan, the humans were the race you played when you wanted to ignore most of the game's mechanics. They're good at everything, can master everything, and have no restricted classes. Humans are the ultimate blank slate, a race that has nothing to them. And this is weird because, have you seen humans in real life? There's tons of culture everywhere. Where the hell is all that culture that exists on planet Earth? Well, it's in the other races.
She argues humans have no culture in D&D. I suppose she just forgot how in the Forgotten Realms there's the Vistani, the Harpers, Neverwinter, there's a city, Waterdeep the city, Icewind Dale is a region, Baldur's Gate the city, the Red Wizards of Thay, the Cult of the Dragon, the Church of Elistray, the Order of the Gauntlet, and the Lord's Alliance. Now granted, those aren't all human-centric societies. There's a lot of races involved with them. They're not all exclusively human. Because D&D, in the Forgotten Realms, in Faerun, the concept is that culture developed not race by race individually, but collectively. The Sword Coast isn't the Sword Coast because it's human-based, it's because it's a bunch of port cities. Easy trade, they're wealthy, big because of that. Civilization developed around landmarks. They all exist at the same time, and so culture developed with all these integrated races alongside each other. Some were separate, sure, but some were integrated. Culture does not develop based on race necessarily, but based on geographic location. Icewind Dale, for example, exists because it's so remote and so north that those who were cast out of normal society had to travel there to form a new society. It's a frontier for those who can't exist in the mainstream. They have roaming clans of barbarian warriors, druids, yetis, a drow and his pet panther, a dwarf, all sorts of things. Lily's failure is that she correlates culture with race and species rather than connect culture with culture. And that's a problem a lot of fantasy fans have. There has to be an elf kingdom, not just a kingdom with elves in it. They can't be an integrated society. There has to be a monolithic, monoracial culture. See, there are homogenous societies and they are integrated societies in fantasy. And I find it increasingly that more and more fantasy storytellers enjoy diverse societies where different races integrate, different cultures integrate to create a new culture collectively. They focus on the city-states rather than the ethno-states. The perspective there is that there needs to be an elf kingdom and a dwarf kingdom, which is even something that Tolkien argues against. The Battle of the Five Armies isn't seen as a glorious battle, like in Peter Jackson's Hobbit. It's a petty, meaningless squabble between various armies of cultures that refuse to integrate, that cannot move past their bigotries, cannot move past their grudges after a victory against a greater collective evil. Once Smaug is gone, they all fight amongst each other.
Most fantasy stories tend to take real-life examples of human culture and bolt them onto fantasy races, often with no rhyme or reason. In Dragon Age and Dungeons & Dragons, the Elves have Celtic and Norse inspirations in their culture. In World of Warcraft, the Night Elves are a mixture of Japan and ancient Rome, while the Blood Elves are a mixture of China and Saudi Arabia, of all places. Warcraft is so committed to this idea, they've done 2 different Moses allegories. They've made the non-human races of Azeroth a cultural smorgasbord. But what's left for the humans?
Lily then goes on a long tangent about how the definitions of whiteness in fantasy and...
Okay, you don't need me to tell you that the default for humans in fantasy games is white people. But why does white people end up translating to the UK with all of the UK's stuff stripped out? Why do they have to be basic? Well, it's because British is a culture and white is not. Stop, I can hear you angrily typing, hear me out. Here's a question for you. What counts as white? Well, the answer has always been, it depends on who you are angry at. White people have changed the definition of who is and isn't white depending on who they're more angry about. A long time ago, being Irish or Italian was a mark for extreme discrimination in the United States, a country settled predominantly by the British.
No, Lily, the British weren't the only people colonizing America. A lot of them were Dutch. Tons of the greater New York area, where I'm from, were settled by the Dutch. Under the British flag, yes, but they were Dutch, you know? Lily does touch upon something here, though. A lot of racism in fantasy worlds is an extension of Eurocentric belief. The problem is, you don't understand that. You can't break it down and see the history behind it. You're looking, again, for an easy answer when a complex one is needed. When Magic the Gathering released their Lord of the Rings set, which, by the way, was one of their most financially successful sets ever, they changed the races of several prominent characters. This resulted in a ton of controversy among a certain subset of fans who could not appreciate familiar characters being reimagined.
In case you were unaware, recently Magic the Gathering revealed that Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings is now black. And the internet is pissed off, and for good reason. So, is this change okay, and are you racist if you dislike this? Here's the tweet that started this wildfire, which depicts Aragorn as a black man with grey hair and a goatee. In the literary works of Tolkien, Aragorn's race is Númenórean. They're basically humans, but stronger and live much longer than regular humans. Aragorn's description in the book is also described as a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with grey, and in a pale, stern face, a pair of keen grey eyes. With this official description by Tolkien himself, it stands to confirm that Aragorn is a European-looking white man with shaggy brown hair and hard eyes. In no way, shape, or form can someone read that description and come to the conclusion that Aragorn is a black man. But of course, in order to appease the almighty ESG score, Magic the Gathering has decided to change Aragorn into a black man.
For the rest of us, though, we saw it as a reminder that these characters don't necessarily need to be white, because their skin tone doesn't influence or inform their characterization. As such, while many people insist that modern fantasy is basically Britain, it does not need to remain Britain to be relevant. Take a look at all the fantasy that's been written based on Asian culture, written by various Asian writers, or even different African cultures. Diversity of perspective is proliferating the fantasy genre, allowing new and exciting different genres of fantasy and science fiction, offering different viewpoints of human culture. And if you have doubts about that, just consider how many popular Japanese anime that lift from Japanese mythology have become popular in the West. I think one of them is even breaking box office records this year.
The concept of whiteness, and by extension non-whiteness, is a construct created by oppressors to make people who have a distinct cultural identity abandon it in favor of a culturalist vacuum so that they can direct them at whatever enemy they see fit. Because someone with a distinct cultural identity may have loyalties that make them inconvenient to those in power.
Lily starts by examining the cultural elements of dehumanization, the same process we discussed earlier with how demons are being conflated with minorities.
Your language is dehumanizing. You target every kind of identity that's represented. I'm embarrassed that we're just realizing it.
And then she just chooses to just do that.
A lot of white people don't really have a culture of their own, in spite of the fact that their family may come from England, Ireland, Scotland, just basically all over Europe. Every single country in Europe has its own very distinct and identifiable culture. But white people, on a conceptual level, well, their culture is just kind of a melting pot of Europe, Africa, indigenous people, and East Asia that makes up most of North America.
In the process of telling white people they have no culture, Lily then conflates the cultures of China, Japan, Korea, India, and Russia all together as Asia, and the Congo, South Africa, Egypt, and Madagascar as Africa. Yeah, good going, Lily. You just did the same thing you told everyone else they're doing. But the irony of what Lily's doing here is she's applying biocentric belief that people are a culture of their skin, that their race determines their culture, to fantasy races, ignoring the actual complex cultures we see throughout history, throughout Faerun, defaulting to a familiar setting.
Outside of World of Warcraft, humans are usually exempt from the race-class restrictions that give RPGs flavor. This is also the reason why some fantasy nerds get such a bug up their ass whenever elves are portrayed as objectively better than humans, to the point many fantasy series make them shorter than humans and physically frail. You can't be better than me because you're something else. Warcraft is the only one that bucks that particular trend, and it's wonderful for it.
Then Lily argues that all elves are better than humans, and need to be, and apparently it's our fault, humans' fault, that we think that humans must be the best.
Despite their presence, humans there actually have a massive inferiority complex because there isn't a single class they can be where they are the quintessential example of that class. And the lack of culture is a big contributing factor to that. Many races have classes baked into their DNA on a cultural level. I know you think humans are the quintessential paladins, but there is a race that literally has the light fused into their very blood, and another that lives around the most powerful concentration of light energy on the planet.
Even though Tolkien's whole world was about how elves are better than humans, and humans had to prove themselves above their past failings to be merit. Again, she doesn't know what she's talking about. What am I talking about? She then argues that it's bad that Dragon Age shows elves as this formerly high and mighty race that had a great fall, and that humanity is doing the same thing elves did in the past now.
This approach to culture affects more than just the world building. Many fantasy stories tend to have what I often call the elf paradox, where the story is almost unilaterally focused on how arrogant the ancient elves were, how they hated outsiders, how they thought they were better than everyone, and they might have done slavery. And then you look at the humans in the present day, and they are all of those things right in front of you, constantly. Dragon Age is especially bad about this.
It's almost as if history is cyclical and we keep making the same mistakes, just like what we see in Tolkien's storytelling. That's not bad writing, that's just reflective of our reality. It's something Tolkien wrote about, with how the various ages ended. It's why mankind, elves, and dwarves all fall for the same vices over greed and vengeance in The Hobbit, while the wargs and orcs fight out of a sense of vengeance and wrath. What Lily fails to understand about Dragon Age, one of many things I should say that Lily fails to understand about Dragon Age, is it's a world constantly divided amongst itself by religious orders and fanaticism, as well as the dangers of power that overwhelm us. And we are constantly put in scenarios where we need to unite to fight some greater threat outside our own petty squabbles, and we consistently fail to do so. However, Lily holds all of humanity accountable for the actions of specific societies, despite the fact that many people fight the systems of control from within and from without in the narrative across the various games. Also, all of this is rich coming from someone who believes in the forcible relocation of Native Canadians and called reservations ghettos. Yeah, just pause to read this to make sure I'm not lying to you. This is what she said. Would it surprise you if you also knew Lily for a while pretended to be native herself? I know, right? Someone who fetishizes other races and treats them as superior to white people, trying to hide the fact that she is also, in fact, white. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't put Lily Orchard's opinions in much stock, especially not front and center as the conclusion of this video. But I feel this video is representative of a reductive voice in fantasy, one that boils culture into what race a character is in, rather than what society they belong to, what society they build with their peers. In Tolkien's world, there are multiple elf, dwarf, and human kingdoms. Even the northern orcs in The Hobbit follow a different hierarchy than the orcs under Mordor. That proves that there is more to it than simply just the elf kingdom, the dwarf kingdom. It's complex. Also, Lily, you're a fool if you think human fighters are not fun to play with.
Fuck me, no wonder Human Fighter gets memed on for being basic in D&D. It's nothing. You get nothing fun to play with. And the only reason you don't get anything fun to play with is because of some idea that you need to be the default. The empty void of a template on which other races get to deviate from in interesting and fun ways.
Just because you decided not to roll up a Tavern Brawler Battlemaster as a specialty in thrown weapons to obviously master throwing all the bar stools into the eyes of a red dragon who dares break into your tavern, that does not mean that other people aren't more creative and more intelligent when rolling up their characters. Regardless of either side, neither party described the monsters in a positive way. Sure, the Horde was praised by Lily, but what members of the Horde? Primarily an elf. An elf who was corrupted, formerly a blonde-haired, blue-eyed elf. A beautiful traditional elf. Lily treats the elf as superior, but the monster? Not so much. In effect, it's no different than Rags getting angry about orcs being made as sympathetic and not being generic fodder. It's the same concept. The idea that certain fantasy races should be better and others should be worse. And you can make extrapolations as to why that is. Is it to reflect their own world beliefs, or is it just because it's easier in a game to fight a monstrous race? It's up to you, but the fact remains it's still a trope that's present, and can be used in different ways by different writers and different creators, and interpreted in different ways, and used by different actors to promote different politics. The fact of the matter is that over time, people have come to associate fantasy with diversity, either diversity of audience or diversity of different species in that fantasy world, with city-states with their own personal religions and doctrines and policies, all inhabited by elves, dwarves, humans, dragonborns, tieflings, drow, orcs, goblins, etc. Gnomes. I forgot to mention gnomes this whole video. Despite classic fantasy sequestering elves and orcs into their own kingdoms, things have changed over time. We're growing more integrated. The old way has become stagnant, has become old-fashioned. Baldur's Gate 3 had a very interesting cast of characters, including one character, Lae'zel, being a Githyanki. Githyanki in D&D have been vastly underrepresented in pop culture, and yet now one of the most popular D&D properties features one. Illithids front and center, Karlach, a tiefling, a major character. We have an entire tiefling grove being a major population in the story. However, there are certain representative races that are underrepresented in the population of Baldur's Gate. For example, despite there being so many very interesting characters, none of them are gnomes, none of them are dwarves that are playable. Yes, there are gnomes and dwarves in the game, but you can't play as them, unless you recruit one or make one yourself. That shows that certain races are still being neglected in pop culture. Then again, we still have some fascinating characters in the place, so I can't say this is a big complaint. But, you know, how different would it be if, say, I don't know, Gale was a dwarf? Would that really change anything? I don't know. Delicious in Dungeon has some of the best dwarves in fantasy, and I'm tired of saying otherwise. Look at these characters, all dwarves, all vastly different characters, but they're all identifiably dwarves. They all have different priorities, different beliefs, different personalities, but they're all dwarves. They are not simply a few base traits across the board, because characters are not just their blood. They're not just their cultures, they're characters with unique wants and needs informed by their surrounding culture, not dominated by it. Monsters are a culture, maybe a loosely assembled one, but one all the same. If we didn't want to see monsters be more sympathetic, fans wouldn't turn the Driss novels into bestsellers. If people didn't want to see the flaws of existing as an elf, Freyrin would not be one of the most popular anime in recent memory. It is not racism that motivates most fantasy fans, it is the desire to hear a good story. A compelling one. One with characters who act in interesting ways, but we want to be transported somewhere else. To a world unlike our own. Informed by it, yes, but unlike our own. Where we can see maybe the problems that befall us be settled in easier fashions, in ways that couldn't happen normally. Or perhaps be swept away, have our own fears and anxieties about ourselves projected onto something else, and have that be swept away. Or maybe taken to its most extreme. Who's to say? Every fantasy book, novel, game, everything has its own unique intention. To properly gauge that intention, you must understand what the author wants to accomplish, what they do to get to that point, and what gets in their own way. Even great literature can be stumbling upon certain tropes that may originate from somewhere problematic, but it is not the end of the discussion. It is simply the beginning. Sit on that for a second.
I write stories about the subjects I'm passionate about.
Right.
And it's like, hey, have you ever considered writing a fantasy story? No, because I don't like fantasy. 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 No, because I don't like fantasy.